It is fascinating how every time in a movie we see a group of people hovering over a blueprint or, more recently, a holographic projection of a building, it's either architects and real estate tycoons or a group of highly skilled citizens planning a heist. While the intentions of the two groups are diametrically opposite in nature, with the former designing for safety and security and the latter breaching it through the very design aimed to protect, the single common thread between the two is how they foreground architecture in their operations. I'm thinking about the Netflix show Money Heist and the Ocean series, and even Bollywood movies like Dhoom and Special 26, where stormwater drains, walls, staircases, parking lots, terraces, and retaining walls become conduits for escorting huge amounts of cash and gold bars out of the buildings. So, our guest for today is Geoff Manaugh, a Los Angeles-based writer and the author of the New York Times-bestselling book, A Burglar's Guide to the City, where he examines architecture and urban planning through the lens of a burglar and some pretty wild real-life cases. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off-Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design perspectives, practices, and research projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off-Center features conversations with radical designers, thinkers, and change makers who are redefining the way we live and interact with the built environment. Okay, Geoff, so I'm super curious. What drew your attention to this very interesting but less talked about discourse of architecture? So what inspired you to look at buildings, infrastructure, and cities through the eyes of a burglar?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny question. It may not be the most expected route of research for someone writing about architecture, but I guess I'd say there were a couple things that really kind of led to me wanting to write the book and kind of perform this research. One was just very simple. I'm a huge fan of films in general, but specifically of heist movies. And it just began to seem sort of unbearably obvious, actually, while watching different movies where people break into a bank or they break into a mansion or they rob a casino. That genre of film is kind of unique in its ability to foreground architecture. It's funny when you're watching movies like that almost inevitably there's a scene where people are actually discussing how a building is designed. And so they crowd around a table and they look at floor plans, or they call up a 3D model on their computer screen and, talking about how to get from one room to the next, or how to get from one building to the building across the street. Suddenly is not just for architecture nerds. It actually has great importance for the narrative, for the characters, for everything that's happening in the drama. And so I started getting really interested in this idea that, if you wanted to watch a truly architectural film, in a sense, you should be watching heist movies. And then I started looking into actual real world reports of bank robberies or of pawn shops or jewelry stores being robbed. And it just became increasingly clear that, one of the things that came out in those types of news articles or news reports, again, was this focus on architecture. People were amazed that a burglary crew had cut a hole in the ceiling and dropped down into a building, or they had used the sewer system to rob a building from below, or they'd cut through a series of walls going through different stores or different homes even in order to get to their eventual target. And so what I wanted to do was really kind of take all of that, to take those architectural details and really focus on them, and look at architecture from the perspective of a burglar. What would a burglar see when he or she sees a building or, comes upon a new complex or a new facility? How would they try to get in that isn't the way the architect planned for them? So not just using the front door, but finding their own way in. And, I think we may even talk about this later, but then also there's a really interesting legal connection between burglary and architecture. They kind of, burglary requires architecture, which is something that maybe we can come back to. But so I'd say that all of those things together really added up to me realizing that this would be a really fun research project and something that would make a great book.
And fun it was. I think when you're talking about a heist, I think we're in the day and age when the most recent episode of Money Heist has just come out, and the Money Heist series on Netflix extensively talks about the plans and the blueprints for the building, and I think the entire series kind of circles around the architecture of the building. So I can definitely relate to your work in that way, but as an architect, I would not necessarily have thought of following that as a scholarly person. And I've read the book, and it's absolutely fascinating. So we'll go back to you touched upon it briefly. So in our initial conversation, you briefly spoke about the technical and legal difference between a theft and a burglary, wherein the burglary is defined as illegal entry into a building with the intent of committing a crime. And that crime could be theft, but the two words are not interchangeable. So one could be a subset of the other, but not the other way around. Well, I guess the differentiating factor, therefore, is the qualification of a building as a site of crime. When we as architects design building, we of course think about safety, the grills and the doors and the parapets and the high walls that we do around the buildings. We think about safety and make provisions for protection against break-ins. But I guess we never really assume the role of a burglar and think about how architecture might facilitate a certain kind of crime. I guess when you're all preparing for design schools in India, there's usually an exercise they make us, like draw a building as you would if you were an ant, draw a bird's eye perspective, but they would never say draw a burglar's eye perspective, if that's anything. So what role does architecture play in the creation of a burglar's playground? Can you talk about some of the fascinating cases you write about in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think I'll start off with that initial idea of, the difference between theft and burglary. It was actually funny when I was writing the book, and even when it first came out, there were people that, were somewhat dismissive of the entire topic because the question was, why are you so interested in taking other people's things? What is it about theft that would interest you to write a whole book about it? But the funny thing is that I didn't write a book about theft, and they're actually totally different crimes. And so you can be a thief, for example, for your entire professional or criminal career and never be a burglar. And you can also be a burglar for 20 years and never steal anything. It's actually just simply a legal category of crime or the intent to commit a crime that happens to take place inside a building that you don't have permission to be in. And so, there's a lot of different things that are, unique to systems of law around the world. And so some of the examples I'll be giving are maybe particular to the United States and maybe aren't necessarily, accurate for, say, India or the United Kingdom or that kind of thing. But nevertheless, you get into this scenario here where entering a building without permission or even staying in a building without permission. So, for example, if a store closes, but you've been hiding in it and you're still in it, 2 or 3 hours after it closes, that's still considered a form of illegal entry. There's actually a great legal term for it. It's called surreptitious remaining, which I think is a great and strange way to look at how to...
Is it any different or similar to trespassing, or no, they're two separate ideas?
It is similar, but they are different. So trespassing doesn't necessarily entail the implication that you're there to commit a crime. It just means that you're there without permission. And so if you add that extra layer where maybe you are, and it can be like almost comically specific, tax evasion, for example, would qualify as something that could make you a burglar. So if I sneak into a building and I do something to evade taxes while I'm there, like I fill out a fake tax form, that would, legally speaking, be burglary. But no, for example, if I've got an unlicensed handgun or if I'm carrying illegal drugs or whatever it might be and I'm inside a building without permission, those two factors mean that a police officer would be able to say that I have committed burglary. And so it's a useful crime from a police person's point of view, because what they can do if they can't necessarily get you for other crimes, they can say, well, you had the intent of committing this crime inside a building, and it's a very easy way just to sort of hold on to someone. And so what that means, though, and it's quite interesting, is that it becomes actually very legally consequential to demonstrate that someone was inside or outside. And so a police officer, for example, would really want to prove that you were inside an architectural structure because it makes their job easier. And you get into an interesting thing where, whether or not someone was beneath an awning instead of actually in a room, or were they in a screened-in porch instead of in the building. There's an example that I still love, actually, that was because it just shows how absurd some of these scenarios can be. So I mentioned that you don't have to steal things to be a burglar. If you threaten someone, that's also a crime that would make you susceptible to a burglary charge. And so there was a case, I can't remember the state it was in, but it was here in the United States where an individual went up to a homeowner and was leaning against the outside of her house and threatening her. But the tips of his fingers had crossed over in from the windowsill into the interior of her house. And so he was considered to have performed an entry into the architectural structure, and while threatening her meant that he could be charged with burglary. So, it's a funny
Wow.
thing where, all of these kind of abstract grad school arguments that you might get into in architecture school where, you're talking about the inside versus the outside, what is an interior? Suddenly those conversations go from being sort of slightly pretentious philosophical arguments to being actually very, very consequential for, what may or may not be happening to someone in terms of being charged with a crime. But in any case, I feel like, there are so many examples of how I think burglars have really kind of tuned into architecture and use it as a way to figure out what they might, hit or target next. One of the people in the book, because you had mentioned asked me about some of the fascinating cases. There's a bunch where architecture is front and center. One comes to mind at least, and that's this guy named Bill Mason, who ended up writing a memoir actually about being, an incredibly prolific jewel thief. He would break into people's apartments and take jewelry, diamonds and that kind of thing. But his actual method of targeting was pretty fascinating, because what he would do, he lived in Florida, and so he would target high-rise apartment buildings like the kind you see all over the Florida coast, kind of like the building that collapsed a couple months ago. He would just go sit on the beach, he'd maybe get a towel or he'd get a lounge chair, and he would sit out there as if he was sunbathing, but he would actually be studying the buildings behind him and watching for patterns. So he would try to see, what are the balconies like? Can I get from this balcony to that one? Is there a fire escape stair on the outside that I could use? Is there somebody who maybe has a ladder because they were hanging Christmas lights or they were hanging a potted plant and they've left their ladder out? Could he get to that ladder and then use it to get up to the next floor? And then he would plot out his methods of entry based on whether or not someone had turned their lights off and seemed to be going out to a restaurant. And he would really kind of piece together these things, one by one, and then eventually find a way, almost like playing a video game, to get from the ground floor up a staircase, maybe from one balcony to the next, from one floor to the next, and then maybe to another balcony. And then finally he would get to the apartment that he was trying to break into. So I think that method of kind of reading architecture from the outside in is not only pretty interesting from this point of view, but even plays into something that he wrote in his memoir, which was that he had grown up really kind of not really with his parents, but with building superintendents, and so he had learned how to not feel as if he didn't belong behind certain doors. So it might say "do not enter" or it might say "do not open," but he became comfortable with like the deep interiors of buildings, I guess you could say. And he would open up doors and he would go into the maintenance halls and he would, basically kind of explore the places or the back routes of a building that people like you or I, maybe we're not comfortable going into those places. But, I feel like that kind of comfort with strange architectural spaces really kind of contributed to his criminal career later. Just one other example, and I mean, there's a ton. The book is really kind of full of these. But there was a really interesting guy who actually had a nickname before they arrested him and figured out who he was. But he was known as Roof Man. And his criminal career is pretty incredible. I mean, it sounds like a comic book or like something a novelist would invent. But he was a guy who would target big box stores or fast food franchises. And he did that on purpose because all the buildings would be very, very similar. So, he was a huge, he was constantly breaking into McDonald's. And so McDonald's tend to have a pretty similar floor plan. The kitchen is in the same kind of place. The manager's office is in the same kind of place. And in addition to that, they also have very similar schedules. And so, it's a franchise. At certain times of day, you're going to count the money. You're going to put the money into a safe. You're going to go through certain procedures because it's a very, very regularized, economic undertaking. And so he used both of those, the timing of the McDonald's, safe opening or safe closing routines, and then the space of the McDonald's building. To basically perform the same burglary over and over and over again. And he would rob dozens and dozens of these places, throughout all over the United States, from California to North Carolina. And, he would often drop down through the roof, which is how he got his nickname, and then rob things and move on. But then eventually he got, pretty, I guess you could say, ambitious or maybe arrogant, and decided that if he was so good at robbing McDonald's, maybe he could also rob big box stores like Targets or Toys R Us or that kind of thing. And so incredibly, actually, later on in his criminal career, he actually broke into a Toys R Us and then tunneled through the wall into a kind of an abandoned store next door. And he built himself an apartment hidden inside the walls behind the bike rack of a Toys R Us. And then he used stolen goods from the Toys R Us, like baby cameras, that you would use to watch your baby in the crib. And he set those up as a kind of surveillance network. And he would, started memorizing the schedules for the employees, sometimes even changing their schedules so that they wouldn't be in on certain days. And then he just sort of lived off of the Toys R Us, going in and out. They thought at one point maybe they had a rat problem because they could hear some sounds, and goods were being moved around in the middle of the night. But they finally, it's a long story, but they finally figured out what it was. And then they found this guy's hidden apartment inside the wall of a Toys R Us. But in any case, I feel like that's another example just of how someone uses kind of the space and time of architecture to plan and implement a criminal plot. And again, the book is full of examples like that, but those are two maybe examples that make it clear about how these kinds of people might operate.
I don't know if this is surprising, shocking, fascinating, or a combination of all three, but there's a part of me that really wants to, clap and commend the creativity of these individuals in terms of looking at buildings through a different perspective and using them as a conduit for their own criminal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I often wonder if, while you were doing research for your book, if there was ever a moment where there was just this moment of ingenuity where it's like, damn, you gotta give it to these guys for just their creativity or the street smartness or whatever word we want to use for it. But with regards to the appropriation of building elements and, all these services as ways to reverse engineer the entire thing. I mean, I'm almost wondering how the templatization of capitalistic enterprises has, was used against themselves as the design for all of them was same. And you're like, okay, well, if I've cracked one McDonald's, I can probably crack all of them. And there has to be like some factor of innovativeness in there. So I'm almost curious if you ever thought about it in that sense where, if there's a toolkit for how you could reverse engineer buildings, and if you were to crack through them, if there's a way to do it, or if there is a common toolkit that these people followed that enabled them to do what they wanted to do. You got to give it to them, though.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. I mean, the funny thing, I think, is that kind of moral peril where you start studying this stuff and you become sort of tempted to think that, the creativity is something that almost deserves to be rewarded, which is an ethical challenge, I think, when navigating this kind of research. But I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book as well, there's many, many ways around that kind of moral dilemma, but one of them is that, you can recognize the creativity of someone's approach without advocating what they're doing. And I think that also it's important to point out that, when you start looking into how a burglar might get into a building, especially if it's by going through a wall from one room to the next, or, using specialty tools to get through a door or through the outside of a building's envelope into the interior, other people not only do that, but need to do that. And it's for totally different reasons. So, for example, there are, and I talk about this in the book, SWAT team police responses to buildings, also uses they use advanced tools to get into facilities. Often those tools, scaled up or made even more aggressive, are just military tools that are also used to get into, the compound where Osama bin Laden was hiding, or that kind of thing.
I was just thinking about that as like, if anybody has seen Zero Dark 30 and the way he was captured in Abbottabad, it's literally all about the play of the house through drone surveillance, and, they mapped out the entire building. They were mapping his movements in the courtyard, When would he be out? It's almost like the guy staying on the beach and looking at people's movements in the buildings.
Totally.
When does he take a walk? When does he go back in? How is the house structured? But
no,
exactly
absolutely.
that.
Yeah, and it's funny because if you look at some of the tools that are used even by those military teams, and if talking about military teams, I'm sure for some of your listeners will sound just as ethically dubious as talking about burglars. But a lot of these tools are actually, some of the places they originate from are actually fire departments. And so the reason why I say that is because, if you have to get into a burning structure and find your way through a wall because there's a corridor that's on fire, or it's so filled with smoke you can't see, or someone is trapped, on the wrong side of a firewall, and if you have to rescue them, or if you have to simply put the fire out, fire departments aren't just, people with water hoses. Often it's axes and saws, and it's tools that are used to respond to car accidents, and to get people out of crashed vehicles. And, when you look at the kinds of things they do, it's very, very similar actually to thinking how a burglar thinks. You look at the floor plan and you realize that there's a different way to get from point A to point B. And it's not what the architect intended. It's to go down through this floor and then through that wall and then maybe out through the exterior or maybe out through a window. But, it's this totally different sort of lateral way of looking at architecture. And so, in and of itself, that is not an immoral way to approach the built environment. It's actually just treating buildings kind of like puzzles. How can I crack this building or solve the puzzle of this building? And then it's up to you, I guess, basically, in terms of your moral inclination, are you going to use that to become a firefighter? Are you going to use that to become a first responder? Or are you going to use that to become a burglar? And so I think that that's one of the ways kind of out of the moral dilemma of talking about burglary from an architectural point of view. It's certainly not, and I'm certainly not advocating that anybody, listening to this podcast or who reads my book, that you inflict misery on other people by breaking into their homes or stealing things that are of value to them personally, which, is obviously not something I advocate. But in terms of thinking about the built environment from a kind of diagonal point of view, I think it's actually really useful and really creative, especially because it opens up, maybe creative opportunities for an architect to think differently about how to get, actual sort of legitimate users of a building from one floor to the next, or, rethinking, maybe a side or back entry point, or even, totally different material palettes in terms of sliding walls or internal windows, or, sort of creative approaches that would be of interest and might come from thinking like a burglar.
While we refill our coffee, here's an excerpt from our next episode with publisher and educator Natasha Moiser, who used crime as a tool for developing fictional narratives in a studio focusing on Walter Gropius's Taunton housing estate.
The house is very small and the stairs are very small. And I said, if you now try to explain, if you murder somebody and you have to carry the body downstairs, then you have to pay attention. What kind of stairs are there? Is it wood? Is it stone? Is it loud? If you, is it making noise when you carry a body? Is the handrail good enough? And so on. And then what happened is suddenly the students started paying more attention about the details.
How would you imagine that the book comes into play in, say, professional practice, now that there's a discourse that you've created, you've made the book a part of designing for security or designing for protection? Was that a consideration while writing the book in terms of how it might be used in offices or practices? Not just by looking at buildings through the eyes of a burglar, but also in terms of designing buildings in a certain way, just so that the cases that you've talked about or the instances that you've measured are not repeated in buildings one is designing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I definitely think that this kind of book, and maybe this book specifically, but would help in terms of just sort of creative or abstract exercises for thinking about buildings differently, kind of as you indicated. On that level, I definitely see use for it. But I do think, actually, we've sort of talked about this, but the interest of architects in designing for security, I think, is something that would be better to foreground during the design process. What I mean by that is that, I think, at least especially in the United States, the idea of designing buildings that are, genuinely secure or, genuinely kind of repel burglars, I think it almost has a kind of political inclination or implication that, you're turning the city into a fortress, or you're turning your back on the public sphere, or you're trying to fortify the private home in a way that might be, adversarial to having a real community in a neighborhood, because everybody lives in these fortresses, or, they live behind huge walls. And I think that that's a misunderstanding, actually, or a misinterpretation of architectural security. And I think a lot of architects, because they are afraid of that, just creating a city of fortresses, they sort of overlook that aspect of the process. And that leads to one of the problems, I think, with architectural security today, which is that, homeowners, business owners, government agencies effectively need to turn to an aftermarket solution for this kind of thing, which is why I think when you go, walk around a neighborhood and look at single family homes and they're surrounded by chain link fences, or their windows have been just covered with bars so that, you can't get in the middle of the night. These are really ugly, inefficient and, unfortunate ways to address the problem of security. And I think if architects kind of leave it up to the aftermarket world, where you just have to go to the nearby security firm or install a burglar alarm or get bars installed on your window, that's actually, I think, one of the problems. And I think if architects were to say, hey, let's genuinely take seriously the creative challenge of security, or the possibility that a burglar might target this building, and then try to figure out a way to do that, I think you would have a really elegant way to fix those kinds of things, because that's exactly what architects do. They think creatively and elegantly about complex spatial problems. And so I think like if that kind of thing was taken seriously in design school or at different design firms, I think we would actually find a really kind of an exciting way to make cities and homes and businesses more secure. And it would actually potentially look better, but it certainly wouldn't look like a world of fortresses or a world of iron bars on windows.
Yeah, I was thinking about, suburbia in the US, and suddenly everybody starts having a moat around their house.
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be kind of ridiculous. It's like, well, we don't want anybody coming into our house, so we're going to have a moat and we're going to lower down bridges every time we want to invite somebody. But I'm almost thinking about the role of technology in this, right? Because I feel like that aspect of security has developed so much and so quickly that you now have other tools that are not as architecturally dominant. They kind of fade into the background, but also help with security. Just on that note, I was also thinking about another scale of territory that kind of figures in the book and that you look at is that of not just the building, but the city. And I mean, this is a broad area. All crimes happen in a city, so it could be in a building, outside a building. But we've all seen movies where the underground sewage network is activated after a bank robbery, where the robbers use it as a means to escape. The sewage serves not only its intended purpose of hosting plumbing lines and transporting waste, but also becomes an exit route after a criminal activity. I'm wondering how urban infrastructure, be it sewage or underground metros or subways, walkways, escalators, public infrastructure facilitates crime.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and it's a fascinating thing to really kind of look into. I think, as you mentioned in the question, underground sewer systems and stormwater networks are kind of famous for their role in Hollywood, but also do play a role in real life crimes. I have an entire chapter in the book that talks about a really famous case here, or notorious case, I should say, here in Los Angeles, where a group of people who have still never been identified. It's an unsolved crime. In fact, actually, it's beyond what's known as the statute of limitations. And so whoever did this crime could actually come forward now, and they would not be able to be arrested for it. Yeah. Wow. So, it's kind of incredible. But, back in the 80s, people who very obviously knew the city's stormwater network extraordinarily well actually used it to break into a bank. So they used it both to get to the bank and to get away from the bank. And, they were so good at what they did that at one point the FBI thought they might have been disgruntled employees of the city water board. So, they knew how to get from one place to another. They knew exactly where the tunnels went. They knew even the exact dimensions of the tunnels because they had 4-wheel vehicles that they used to drive around underground while they were digging their tunnel. And so, you really can use or sort of bend infrastructure, toward the direction of a crime. And, I talk about in the book how even the geology of a city can impact what kinds of crimes occur there. Because if you have a place like Los Angeles, it's quite easy to tunnel here. It's almost impossible, though, to tunnel in a place like Manhattan if you're dealing with like really heavy bedrock. You'd have to be Elon Musk or, a disgruntled billionaire to have a tunneling a machine that could get you into a bank. And I have a feeling they would hear you coming. So cities with, certain kinds of ground conditions, are more amenable to bank crimes, which is why you see a lot of bank crimes in places like London with all of its clay, or even Berlin, which is built on very sandy soil. And so, and also places in Brazil, too, are very easy to tunnel into. And so there's a lot of tunnel crime in Brazil. But, I was interested to hear about things like, another example I give often is something that I learned about from the FBI, that police departments also use this phrase. But is the idea of what's called a stop and rob. And so that's an example of where urban transportation infrastructure overlaps with financial institutions in a way that makes those financial institutions vulnerable to crime. And so a stop and rob would be a business, like a bank or maybe a credit union or a check cashing facility that's at the bottom of an off-ramp from the freeway and at the bottom of an on-ramp for a freeway. And so that doesn't happen all that often where those two things overlap. And yet, when you find it, you've kind of found a perfect vulnerability hidden in the urban design of the city around you, because it means you can pull off a freeway, you can rob a bank, you can run outside and get back in your car and be back on the freeway, all within 5 minutes. And, before the police have even gotten a helicopter into the air, you're, half a county away, or you're in a totally different part of the city, and you're using the city's urban freeway system, as a kind of accomplice in that act. And there's just something really fascinating about that for me, where, when urban planners in the 1960s were kind of building and planning all of these freeways for cities like Los Angeles, did they know or suspect that they were also laying the ground for a future crime spree? Because at one point in the early 1990s and the late 1980s, LA was the bank robbery capital of the world. At its height, there was a bank robbery in the city every 45 minutes of every workday, which is an awful lot of bank robbery. And, there were many reasons for that, but one of them is the city's freeway system. It just made those banks very vulnerable. And there's a couple other examples. I don't want to go on too long.
Do you think there was ever a urban planning policy written that would have tried to correct this bank-freeway relationship vulnerability at some place? Or no, it's still not a part of the policy as to bank cannot be located within XYZ miles of on-way or off-way or something of that sort?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I am not aware of any restrictions like that. That doesn't mean that there aren't any, but I am not aware that there's a restriction like that. In fact, that's another example, I think, of where, security questions, kind of like what we were talking about a few minutes ago, really kind of just get offloaded onto the property owner. And so if you don't want your bank to get robbed, rather than turn to the city to, do anything with its freeways or whatnot, you just have to invest in, plexiglass bulletproof barriers, or more cameras, or dye packs in the cache, or, better sight lines, so that if somebody does flee the bank into your parking lot to get away, you can actually get the license plate number of the car, or that kind of thing. And so, it's a tricky and strange choreography between banking institutions, federal investigators who are tasked with looking after bank crime, and then also, the criminals themselves. I mean, it's interesting to point out, for example, that at one point in the 80s, in particular here in Los Angeles, a lot of banks just simply didn't have a security guard, because it was actually, if you added up the amount of money that was stolen every year through bank heists, it would be less than the salary of a permanent security guard. And so they just said to themselves, why? It's just incredible. The money, in a sense, wasn't worth protecting. And so finally, what actually happened, and I think it's such an American thing, is that there were so many lawsuits. And so tellers who worked at a bank would sue the bank, for not protecting them. Even sometimes customers would sue because they were involved in a bank heist and they were terrified. And the lawsuits are actually what made these banks realize that they had to start investing in security. And so that actually led to this kind of explosion in these are called bandit barriers. Those are the plexiglass walls that are between you and a bank teller. That are bulletproof and that don't allow you to get over the counter. That and security systems like cameras, and then obviously permanent guards. But it's just really funny that that's actually what led to kind of the explosion of the securitization of banks here.
I mean, I get it. It's like simple financial things, right? Just like the return on investment wasn't worth the investment itself. We're like, okay, we won't keep a security guard. We'll deal with it when we have a heist.
Yeah. No, it's incredible.
So Geoff, it's been a while since you wrote this book, and I'm sure since you wrote this book, especially, dozens of new cases might have popped up, and maybe now every time somebody would read about a certain case where they could connect architecture to a burglary, they would probably have reached out to you and be like, hey, this is what happened, and this is what made us think of your book. Any plans for doing like a second, third edition or a part 2 to the book where you would record all the advancements and all the new things that you've came up with, and what's next for you? And if you want to talk about your new book.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think writing an actual sequel is probably not something that I would undertake, but I do think maybe like an expanded edition or a second edition, looking back even at some of the crimes that are in the book, just sort of catching people up with what happened to those people, I think would be fascinating. And as you mentioned, I mean, there's just been so many hundreds, if not thousands, of crimes since then that might be worth looking into. I have actually kind of continued this sort of reporting just in terms of freelance journalism, and just one recent case that I won't go into too much detail on, but which easily could have been a chapter in the book, was I learned from a safecracker here in Los Angeles, a legal safecracker. So if you get locked out of your safe, or if a bank has a safe and they can't get into it because they maybe the lock broke, or there's something has gone wrong, you'll call people like this who will show up and they can drill the safe, they can get into it. They have a lot of technology for getting through safe doors. In any case, I was following him around Los Angeles for about 6 months and wrote a profile of the safe cracking industry through him. But he kept telling me about this case in Florida, that was just totally fascinating. It was about a safe cracker who had basically gone rogue. It was somebody who you would hire, to, like, if you're, let's say a family member dies and they're the only person that knows the combination to the safe in your house, it was this kind of person that you would call and he would get you out of a tight spot. But he decided, this guy in Florida, decided to use his skills to become basically a super burglar. And so he teamed up with some other people who used to be law enforcement officers. And one of them was a pilot. And so they actually had an airplane and they would fly around the United States, mostly the Southeast, and they would rob jewelry stores. They occasionally would hit supermarkets as well, because there's a lot of cash in supermarkets. But I loved this idea of a burglary crew. It was just crazy, where they have their own airplane and, they're former cops and safecrackers, and, they're just flying around the country robbing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of goods. And it seemed like a story I really wanted to learn more about. And so I was actually able to speak with one of the people in the burglary crew. I met some of their victims, which I think was a really important aspect of this kind of story. This crime, these types of crimes, property crimes, looting and theft, they're not victimless crimes, and often they aren't, the damage that they do aren't covered by insurance companies. And you can really ruin someone's life, both professionally and certainly emotionally, by really kind of violating, any sense of, safety or security they might have. And so that was something that I really wanted to include in that article. But yeah, that kind of thing I think could have made, a chapter in A Burglar's Guide to the City, but, maybe I'll try to incorporate that into a future edition. In terms of new stuff, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that's pretty fun that I'm working on now. One thing that was interesting was that, because of the nature of A Burglar's Guide to the City, looking at architecture and crime, the book was optioned for television. It never moved forward, which is sad, but it also meant that a bunch of people in Hollywood, became interested in other pieces that I was working on. And so I've had a couple projects that have been sort of optioned for Hollywood development. And one of those is a short story that is being filmed for Netflix, actually as we speak. Woohoo! So yeah, it's super exciting. Actually, it's a ghost story. It's actually not burglars. It was a short ghost story that I wrote for Halloween a couple years ago, and it's now being filmed in New Orleans, and I think it will be on Netflix maybe by the late summer of 2022. Although the release date isn't clear yet. But so I've been working on some film stuff and some TV stuff, which has been really exciting and kind of moving out of the architecture world. But then having said that, yeah, there's this new quarantine book that my wife and I just wrote. I guess the short version of that is that it basically looks at quarantine kind of the way A Burglar's Guide to the City looks at burglary, which is that quarantine is a way of using architecture to prevent a disease from spreading. And so we went down the rabbit hole of looking at, what quarantine is, what its origins during the Black Death, and how it has shaped the built environment, because quarantine, if you really look at it, it's affected international borders, it's affected, our passports today, it's obviously affected the built environment. And then with COVID-19, we also saw that it is, can really kind of change people's lives. And so the quarantine book just came out 2 months ago, and the paperback will be out next summer. And that's also been a really interesting way to, I guess, look at the built environment or look at urban design.
I think came out is an understatement. I think you should say came out with bells and whistles and to great reviews from literally all the major newspapers and reviewing boards. So I personally can't wait to get my hands on it, because that's something it's something everybody was thinking about. And it was also just at the time of me finishing grad school, and a lot of student projects and a lot of student forums were talking about the architecture of isolation. And there were a lot of these Instagram blogs that had popped up where, you could submit your room. So just like everybody sketching out their rooms in plan and, how you're moving about the room throughout the day. So it just made people think about architecture in a very different way. And something that I personally noticed from applying to, I have lost count of how many jobs I applied for that summer. But in terms of applying for jobs, was that while all the big firms were struggling in terms of keeping up and keeping their staff, and they were furloughing people, laying off people, there was a sudden rise, small rise, but still a sudden rise in the hiring practices of very small boutique firms who were designing single-family weekend homes.
Oh, wow.
And I found that fascinating, because I was, you would apply to the usual places, but none of them were hiring. So we're like, okay. And then every morning that I would log into Harvard's career website, and there would be these beautiful little boutique firms based out of LA, based out of Hamptons, based out of Provincetown, based out of suburbs in different states, and they would be building gorgeous houses, like expensive, gorgeous houses. And they were all hiring. And I was like, wow, what does this say about architecture very broadly, where all these large infrastructure projects are all on hold right now? The funding's been taken back. It's all been redirected into COVID relief. And everybody who could afford to suddenly felt that they needed to get out of the city, and they needed to have a space where they could breathe fresh air. I think that's what it comes down to, is just having that real estate where you could step out and get good air and not be restricted to the four walls. So I've been waiting for the book, and I can't wait for it to release in India so that I can have a look at it.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating observation, actually. Yeah, how the hiring practices of different scale architecture firms might indicate something about the state of society at a given moment. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, but hey, Geoff, this was an absolute joy. I don't use the word joy enough after recording an episode, but it was an absolute delight and joy to speak to you. And I can already tell, if you're on board with me, I'm going to reach out to you, because I know at some point we're going to do a season on like post-pandemic design, whatever that means.
Okay, sure.
And we would love to talk about your next book and that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would look forward to it. Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation as well. Thanks for the interest, and I look forward to the episode.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at Arc of Center, and write to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.